Treason, a word that once carried more than just the weight of betrayal. It carried the certainty of unimaginable suffering, a punishment so gruesome, so deliberately cruel, that it lingered in the nightmares of history for centuries, hanged, drawn, and quartered, a fate worse than death. For over 500 years, this was England's most terrifying sentence, reserved only for those who committed the gravest of sins defying the crown. It was a punishment not just meant to end a life, but to send a message. Tonight, we step back in time to the sights, the sounds, and the agony of a man condemned to suffer this ultimate horror. August 23rd, 1305, Westminster. The crowd roars as William Wallace, the leader of Scotland's rebellion, is pulled from the Tower of London. He has been found guilty of treason against King Edward I, and the punishment is death. But not just any death. Wallace will endure the full force of England's justice, a spectacle designed to break not just the body, but the very spirit of anyone who dares defy the king. The first stage, the drawing. Wallace is not taken to the execution site with dignity. No, he is tied to a wooden hurdle-ace, arms stretched above his head, his body sprawled out, and dragged by horse through the filthy streets of London. The route is not short. It winds through the busiest areas, past jeering crowds, past merchants, past noblemen who sneer in contempt. The streets are lined with mud, waste, and the filth of the city. Wallace, still a warrior, grits his teeth, but his body is bruised, scraped, and bloodied by the time he reaches the gallows at Smithfield. The second stage, the hanging. But make no mistake, this is not meant to kill him. No. That would be merciful. The executioner watches closely. He cannot allow the condemned to slip into unconsciousness. Wallace's face turns red, his body convulses, and just before death claims him, he is cut down. He gasps for air, his chest heaving, but this is far from over. Now comes the drawing. Wallace, barely able to move, is laid out on the executioner's block. Before him stands the man who will now commit the most horrifying act of all, disembowelment. There is no rush. The executioner takes his knife and begins. A slow cut, precise and deliberate. The blade moves across his stomach, slicing deep, spilling his insides onto the dirt. The agony is indescribable. His intestines are pulled out, his body still writhing, his screams echoing through the air. But the horror does not stop there. His genitals are cut away, a final act of humiliation. His intestines, still glistening, are thrown into a fire, burned before his very eyes. This is not just an execution. It is a message, one carved into his very flesh. And at last, the beheading, with one mighty swing, the axe falls. Silence, the body crumples. The head is held up, dripping with blood, a trophy for the king's justice. But even now, Wallace's punishment is not over. His body is taken and quartered, each limb severed and sent to different corners of England, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling. His head dipped in tar and placed upon a spike on London Bridge, a warning, a symbol. This is what happens to those who challenge the king. For centuries, this punishment would be carried out again and again. No crime was more despised than treason, and no punishment more feared than being hanged, drawn, and quartered. By the 19th century, even England had to admit that such cruelty had no place in a civilized world. In 1814, the punishment was finally abolished. But the echoes of its brutality remain. Even today, the phrase hanged, drawn, and quartered sends a shiver down the spine. For those who endured it, death was not the worst fate. It was the suffering before it. Some punishments are so cruel, they never truly leave history.